She defied her family's deep-seated racism for love, but that love cost her everything. One man's obsession turned into a brutal crime that shocked the nation. Reagan Whitmore was born into wealth, privilege, and a legacy of hate, one she spent her entire life rejecting. While her family upheld generations of prejudice, she fought for justice, equality, and love. And in doing so, she unknowingly sealed her fate. Her relationship with Judge Nasir Holloway was everything her family despised. He was a brilliant, successful black man with aspirations of joining the Supreme Court. But to Reagan, he wasn't a symbol of defiance, he was simply the man she loved. For nearly 2 years, they kept their love a secret, knowing the danger it carried. And that danger had a name: Weston Whitmore. Reagan's older brother was a failed businessman turned online extremist, consumed by white supremacist ideology and a delusional sense of control over his sister. When he learned the truth about her relationship, his obsession turned deadly. How does love survive in a world poisoned by hate? Can defying prejudice come at too high a price? This is the story of Reagan Whitmore, a woman who dared to love fearlessly and paid the ultimate cost. Before we dive into this shocking case, like this video and subscribe to Inspector Stan for more chilling tales of love, lies, and betrayal. 29-year-old Reagan Whitmore was born into a world where wealth and privilege were the expectations, not the exceptions. Raised in the affluent, conservative community of Charleston, South Carolina, her life was one of exclusive country clubs, private schools, and lavish events. Her family, deeply entrenched in their racist beliefs, had a long history of wealth and influence. But Reagan never subscribed to their way of thinking. From a young age, she knew she was different from the rest of the Whitmores. While they upheld generations of prejudice, Reagan rebelled. Devoting herself to social justice causes, working as a paralegal in criminal defense, and fighting for those whom her family considered beneath them. The Whitmores saw her as the family outcast, the black sheep, always at odds with their views, but Reagan never cared. She was determined to live a life true to her own values, not the ones handed down to her. It was in this world of contradiction that Reagan met Nasir Holloway. Nasir was a 42-year-old black federal judge with a reputation for integrity and an ambition that could not be shaken. He had spent years working his way through the legal system, earning the respect of his peers for his intelligence, fairness, and commitment to justice. His ultimate goal was to secure a Supreme Court nomination, and his career was on track to make that a reality. Reagan met Nasir at a legal conference in Washington, D.C. They were introduced by a mutual colleague, a well-respected attorney who had worked alongside both of them in different cases. From the moment they spoke, Reagan was captivated by Nasir's intellect and warmth. He was everything her family rejected: successful, powerful, kind, and unafraid to stand up for what was right, even in the face of adversity. Their connection grew quickly. They shared long conversations about the law, justice, and their mutual desire to make the world a better place. Reagan found in Nasir someone who didn't judge her for rejecting her family's beliefs, someone who understood her mission to fight for the marginalized. And Nasir found in Reagan a woman who was not afraid to challenge the status quo, a partner who could see beyond race and social expectations to the person he truly was. Their bond wasn't just built on shared values, it was built on a deep, unwavering respect for each other. But their love was also forbidden. Both knew the consequences of letting it become public. Reagan's family was well known for their racist views, and Nasir's success would only fuel their contempt. A relationship between a privileged white woman and a black man with such high aspirations would not be tolerated, not in Reagan's world. They kept their love a secret, confiding only in a small circle of trusted friends. Their connection, though, was undeniable. They would steal quiet moments together, talking about their hopes, their dreams, and the challenges they both faced in their respective fields. Nasir had never felt more alive, and Reagan had never felt more understood. But even in the safety of their secrecy, the dangers lingered. Reagan knew that if her family found out about Nasir, it wouldn't just be an emotional blow, it would be a full-blown crisis. Her older brother, Weston Whitmore, wouldn't let that go unpunished. Weston had always been possessive of her, treating her less like a sister and more like an extension of himself. Nasir worried for Reagan's safety, but she always brushed it off. She refused to live in fear. She was determined to love who she wanted, no matter the cost. But the cost, it turned out, would be higher than she could have ever imagined. Weston Whitmore had always felt a sense of ownership over his younger sister, Reagan. At 33, he was a man consumed by failure, unable to hold down a stable career or carve out a meaningful life for himself. His bitterness had led him into the darkest corners of the internet, where he immersed himself in white supremacist forums and radical ideologies. Weston had become fixated on the idea of racial purity, idolizing violent racists and fantasizing about a race war. He viewed interracial relationships as the ultimate betrayal, a crime against the very essence of his beliefs. Reagan's defiance of their family's values had always irked him, but when he found out about her secret relationship with Nasir Holloway, a highly respected black federal judge, it triggered something inside him. His obsession with controlling Reagan grew, and it was only a matter of time before he found out the truth. Weston had always been paranoid, and his suspicions about Reagan's relationship with Nasir began to escalate. At first, it was just a whisper, a murmur of a rumor he overheard. But as Reagan became more distant and her behavior shifted, Weston's fixation deepened. He began spying on her, monitoring her movements and conversations, searching for any hint of betrayal. Then, one night, he found what he was looking for. Weston had always prided himself on his ability to access information, whether it was by hacking into Reagan's phone or sneaking into her personal space when she wasn't around. One evening, while Reagan was out with Nasir, Weston seized the opportunity. He unlocked her phone, using her fingerprint, and scrolled through her messages. His heart raced as he found text exchanges between Reagan and Nasir, filled with affectionate words, plans to meet in private, and a shared vision of a future together. The more he read, the more enraged he became. This wasn't just a casual affair, it was a serious relationship, and Reagan was willing to throw away everything for a man who wasn't even white. The knowledge consumed Weston. It gnawed at him, festering until he could no longer control his rage. Every message, every intimate word between Reagan and Nasir felt like a personal affront to everything he believed in. His resentment towards his sister grew into an uncontrollable obsession. He started following her, showing up uninvited at places where she and Nasir spent time, and keeping track of every interaction between them. Weston's anger turned into paranoia. He couldn't stop thinking about the betrayal he perceived. His family's legacy was being shattered by Reagan's defiance. He was convinced that her relationship with Nasir was a threat, not just to their family, but to the very foundation of everything he had worked to uphold. The deeper he dug into their lives, the more it became clear to him. Reagan was willing to reject everything her family had ever stood for, everything Weston had fought for. His obsession with controlling her spiraled into madness, and in his twisted mind, there was only one way to make her see the error of her ways. The more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that Reagan had to be stopped, and Nasir, the man she loved, had to be removed from the equation. Weston's anger, once simmering beneath the surface, began to boil over. His fixation on Reagan's relationship had pushed him to the brink, and soon, there would be no turning back. On a scorching August evening, Reagan returned to her Charleston townhouse after spending a weekend at Nasir's home. The sun had barely set, but the warmth of the day still lingered in the air as she unlocked her front door. What she didn't know was that her brother, Weston, had already broken in. He waited in the darkness of the living room, his eyes burning with fury, the hammer he had stolen from the garage gripped tightly in his hand. He had been watching, stalking her every move, consumed by the growing obsession that now controlled him. As Reagan stepped inside, the faint click of the door closing behind her echoed through the empty space. She didn't even have time to react before Weston emerged from the shadows, his face twisted in a mask of rage. "Reagan," he snarled, his voice low but full of venom. "You disgust me." Reagan froze for a split second, the shock of seeing him there seizing her chest. "Weston, what the hell are you doing here?" she demanded, trying to make sense of the scene unfolding before her. Weston's eyes flicked to the floor, where he had thrown her phone. "I know everything," he spat. "I read your messages. You think you're fooling me?" A sense of dread washed over Reagan, but she quickly pushed it aside. She had made her choice long ago, and she wasn't about to back down now. "Nasir is a better man than you'll ever be," she shot back, her voice steady, despite the pounding of her heart. Weston's eyes darkened, his grip tightening on the hammer. "Better? You think that animal is better than your own brother?" he growled. Reagan's lips curled into a defiant smile. "He's more of a man than you could ever dream of being. He's intelligent, successful, kind. Everything you're not." Weston's face contorted with rage. His breathing grew heavier as he stumbled a step forward. "You're confused," he muttered, his voice shaking with barely contained fury. "He's brainwashed you, Reagan." "No, Weston," Reagan said, her voice firm, "I love him. And nothing you do will change that." Those words were the breaking point. Weston's face twisted into an expression of primal anger, and with a snarl, he swung the hammer with all his strength. The metal connected with the side of her face with a sickening crack, and Reagan crumpled to the floor, her vision blurring as blood poured from the wound. "Weston!" she gasped, struggling to comprehend the pain, her head swimming. She tried to crawl away, to escape, but he was relentless. He swung the hammer again, this time with even more force, the blow landing squarely on her jaw. The sound of bone shattering filled the room, followed by Reagan's strangled scream. She raised her hands to shield herself, but Weston didn't stop. Each strike was more brutal than the last, her skull cracked open, her body limp beneath him. Reagan's scream soon faded into silence. Her blood pooled around her on the floor, staining the hardwood beneath her. Weston stood over her, panting, his chest rising and falling as he looked down at her lifeless body. He was still, a twisted satisfaction filling him. But he wasn't done yet. In his sick obsession with control, Weston grabbed Reagan's phone from the floor, using her fingerprint to unlock it. With an eerie calmness, he typed out a message to Nasir, pretending to be Reagan. "Come over, baby. I miss you." He stared at the screen for a moment, a faint, sick smile creeping across his face as he imagined Nasir's reaction. The silence of the townhouse was deafening, and he could almost hear the ticking of the clock as he waited for Nasir to arrive. When the door finally opened, Weston's breath caught in his throat. Nasir walked in, unaware of the horror that had been carefully orchestrated. The moment Nasir stepped inside, Weston leaped from his hiding place, the hammer raised high in his hand. But Nasir, with his strength and training, was ready. He reacted quickly, slamming Weston to the ground and pinning him there, trying to comprehend what was happening. It was then that Nasir saw her. Reagan's lifeless body lay in a pool of blood, her face mutilated beyond recognition. The sight of her shattered everything within Nasir. He gasped, his heart racing in disbelief, but before he could react further, the police arrived. Neighbors had heard the disturbance and reported it, sending officers to the scene. As they burst through the door, they saw Nasir standing over Weston, bloodied and shaken, and quickly assumed the worst. Nasir was restrained, his arms yanked behind his back as officers shouted orders, unsure of what had transpired. But the truth came out almost immediately when Weston, covered in Reagan's blood, began to laugh, a chilling, maniacal sound that filled the room. He looked up at the officers with a smirk, his eyes gleaming with twisted satisfaction. "They'll never have mongrel babies now," he muttered under his breath, almost as if savoring his victory. It was then that the officers realized the truth. Nasir was not the killer. Weston, his hands stained with Reagan's blood, was the one responsible for the horror that had unfolded in the townhouse. They quickly handcuffed him, his smug expression never faltering, as he continued to mutter his cruel, racist remarks. The nightmare that Reagan had unknowingly walked into was now a cold, hard reality. Reagan's murder sent shockwaves through the country, sparking a nationwide conversation that touched on race, hate crimes, and the terrifying impact of radicalization. The brutal killing of a woman who had dared to love outside the confines of her family's hatred was a tragic symbol of how deeply ingrained prejudice could shape lives, and end them. Nasir Holloway, once a rising legal star with aspirations for the Supreme Court, found himself thrust into the media spotlight as the face of a tragedy that exposed the horrific depths of racial hatred and violence. For some, he was a victim of circumstance, an innocent man left to mourn a love lost too soon. But for others, his connection to Reagan's death was a bitter reminder of the dangerous ideology that permeated much of America's underbelly. White supremacist groups across the country rallied behind Weston, celebrating his violent actions as a warped form of justice, while activists and social justice groups called for accountability and demanded that the true cost of hate be reckoned with. It became clear that Reagan's death had ignited a firestorm of debates that were as much about race as they were about the ever-present violence that followed prejudice. Investigators uncovered chilling voice recordings of Reagan's final moments, a conversation with Weston that revealed not only her fear but also her defiance. In those last, desperate exchanges, Reagan refused to back down, even as she knew the rage she had provoked in her brother. Her strength in the face of overwhelming hate became a poignant symbol, as the recordings captured her unwavering love for Nasir, even when she faced the wrath of her own flesh and blood. The evidence also revealed the disturbing truth about Weston's involvement in extremist online communities, exposing his deep ties to white supremacist forums that glorified violent acts of hate. His obsession with his sister's interracial relationship and his growing resentment toward Nasir painted a clear picture of his motive, a man consumed by rage and distorted beliefs who had crossed the line from words to violent action. As the media continued to cover the trial and the investigation, the public debate grew more divisive. Some saw Reagan as a martyr for love, a symbol of defiance against bigotry and prejudice, while others questioned Nasir's decision to keep their relationship a secret. Had Reagan been more open about her love for Nasir? Could the tragedy have been avoided if the couple had been less cautious, less fearful of the violent backlash they might face? These questions lingered in the public's mind as the case played out in real time. Yet, as the discussions intensified, the conversation also turned to larger questions about racial violence, white supremacy, and the costs of defying long-held prejudices. Reagan's murder was not just the death of a young woman, it was the reminder of a world still deeply divided by hatred, a stark reminder of the personal toll that racial intolerance continued to take on individuals and families alike. In the aftermath, some saw Reagan's death as a symbol of the fight for racial equality, a fight that could cost you everything if you dared to love without boundaries. Others grappled with the painful reality that while love might seem like the ultimate act of resistance, sometimes that very love could make you a target in a world where hate still reigned supreme. Weston showed no remorse throughout the trial, his face twisted into a smirk as graphic crime scene photos were displayed for the court. His cold indifference to the horror of his actions sent a chilling message to everyone present. His defense team argued that Weston had suffered from extreme mental distress upon discovering Reagan's interracial relationship with Nasir, attempting to paint him as a man overwhelmed by the betrayal of his sister's love. However, the jury saw through the thin veil of his excuses. After just 2 hours of deliberation, they convicted Weston of first-degree murder, the evidence of his deep-seated hatred and violent tendencies impossible to ignore. As the judge read the verdict, Weston remained unflinching, his grin never wavering. When it came time for sentencing, Weston was handed the maximum punishment, life without the possibility of parole. As the guards moved to escort him out of the courtroom, Weston turned to Nasir, his voice low and venomous, whispering, "At least she ain't breeding with you now." The words dripped with contempt, a final insult that summed up his view of the world, a world where race was a line that could never be crossed. Nasir stood motionless, but the weight of the moment was palpable. When it was his turn to speak, he took the stand and delivered a statement that resonated far beyond the courtroom. "You didn't just take Reagan from me," he began, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "You took away a woman who was brave enough to defy hate. She was a light in this dark world, and her strength was more than you could ever understand. But you didn't win. Reagan's legacy will outlive your pathetic existence." His words echoed through the courtroom, a reminder that no matter how hard Weston tried to erase Reagan, her spirit and defiance would live on in the hearts of those who knew her. This case is a heartbreaking reminder of the deadly consequences of hate and intolerance. Reagan Whitmore loved fearlessly, and for that, she paid the ultimate price at the hands of her own brother, someone who should have cared for her, protected her, and stood by her. But in his eyes, her love was a betrayal, a crime that could only be answered with violence. Her tragic end, though, is not the end of her story. Love is stronger than hate, and Reagan's story, her defiance, her courage, and her unwavering commitment to justice, will continue to inspire and resonate with those who refuse to bow to prejudice. Her life, though stolen too soon, serves as a powerful reminder that the fight for love, equality, and acceptance is one worth waging. Could Reagan's death have been prevented? How can we, as a society, fight against the radicalization that breeds such violence? These are questions that demand reflection, and they urge us to confront the systems that allow hatred to grow unchecked. If this story shocked you, like and subscribe to Inspector Stan for more cases that explore the darkest intersections of love, lies, and betrayal.